Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we wander barefoot, well, sandal-footed if you'd like historical accuracy, into the sun-bleached stones of ancient Greece, where public squares shimmer under the heat and respectable citizens casually nap in places that today would probably require a no-loitering sign and at least 3 annoyed security guards. You drift into a world where marble columns glow white beneath a punishing Mediterranean sun, where olive trees twist lazily in the breeze, and where the afternoon can hit you like an overheated wool blanket straight from Zeus himself. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive 2 hours here without complaining, asking for iced coffee, and desperately searching for Wi-Fi. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me your local time and where you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the Agora, the pulsing heart of the Greek city-state, sometime around the 5th century BCE, where philosophy, gossip, olive oil, lawsuits, figs, and suspiciously loud goats all somehow coexist in one sunlit civic soup. The stones beneath your sandals are already warm, even though the day is still young, and the scent of baked earth mingles with fish, wine, sweat, and herbs in a combination that would absolutely not pass modern fragrance testing. At dawn, this place is alive. Merchants shout prices for pottery and onions. Politicians rehearse speeches with the dramatic flair of men who absolutely would have loved social media. Philosophers gather followers by saying things just confusing enough to sound profound. Somewhere nearby, a rooster is performing like he's on a world tour. The Agora was not just a market. This was the center of public life. Commerce, religion, politics, and social rituals all braided together like a very sweaty toga party. One of the most widely known facts about ancient Greek civilization is how central the polis or city-state was to identity. Athenians especially prized public life. To be visible was to belong. To participate was to exist. And oddly enough, that visibility included sleeping in public when conditions demanded it. By late morning, the Mediterranean sun begins its slow transformation from pleasant golden warmth into celestial punishment. Greece's climate, particularly in summer, could be intensely hot, especially in urban centers built with reflective stone and limited shade. Historians widely agree that daily schedules often adapted around this heat. Activities rose early, slowed in peak afternoon, then resumed later. It's less lazy ancient people and more biological common sense, which, to be fair, modern office culture occasionally treats like witchcraft. You wander beneath a stoa, one of those long-covered walkways lined with columns that seem designed by someone who deeply understood both aesthetics and heat stroke prevention. The stoa offers shade, airflow, and enough public visibility that your nap remains socially acceptable rather than suspicious. Here, on cool stone benches or against a column, men recline, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just practically. And this is where the strange modern misconception dissolves. Public napping in ancient Greece was not necessarily shameful. In many contexts, especially during oppressive heat, it was practical. You are not witnessing mass laziness. You are watching adaptation. There's something deeply funny about imagining stern, marble-bust philosophers gently drooling in the afternoon while pretending they're contemplating virtue. Socrates may question the nature of justice, but even he probably appreciated not roasting alive by noon. Historians are still debating whether certain references to rest in public spaces reflected normalized custom or merely tolerated necessity, but the environmental logic is hard to ignore. You pass traders who, after unloading amphorae, stretch beneath awnings. Older men settle under olive trees. A dog sleeps with the spiritual confidence of a creature who has transcended economics entirely. Even some officials may retreat briefly from civic duties, because democracy is important, but so is not fainting face first into your lentils. One lesser-known detail is that many public spaces in Greek cities were not designed solely for movement or ceremony. They also provided passive environmental regulation. Stone colonnades, fountains, and orientation toward breezes created cooler zones. It was urban planning with an accidental side effect: nap infrastructure. Basically, ancient architects invented the shaded plaza, and your local shopping mall food court owes them a thank you card. Of course, not everyone had equal access to leisurely rest. Status mattered. Free male citizens generally had more freedom over time and public presence than women, enslaved people, or laborers. But the rhythm of heat affected everyone. Even the hardest working body eventually negotiated with the sun. As cicadas begin their relentless electric chorus, you notice the soundscape shifting. Morning urgency softens, conversations lower, sandals scuff more slowly. The city doesn't stop, it exhales. This is not a full shutdown, not yet, but a communal lowering of intensity. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of your laptop entering sleep mode because too many tabs are open. And here's an odd truth. While Greeks are often remembered for grand intellectual achievements, democracy, theater, geometry, philosophy, they were also profoundly physical realists. Bodies mattered. Climate mattered. Human limitation was not some moral failing. If the sun was trying to cook you like garlic on hot stone, resting was wisdom. The Greeks even understood balance as a virtue. Nothing in excess, as the Delphic maxim advised. Presumably, this included excessive standing around in direct sunlight while pretending productivity. As you settle into the shade yourself, back against a sun-cooled pillar, you begin to understand the public square not merely as a place of transaction, but as a shared organism. It breathes with the day. It strains, then softens, and somewhere between commerce and citizenship, between argument and stillness, between roasted chickpeas and philosophical debate, there is room for sleep. Not the luxurious sleep of feather mattresses or blackout curtains, of course, more like survival with style. A folded cloak becomes a pillow. A satchel becomes lumbar support. A column becomes your coworker who silently blocks the sun. This is where your journey truly begins, not with battles or temples, but with something wonderfully ordinary, people being tired in hot weather and making surprisingly elegant communal choices about it. So as the sun climbs higher over tiled roofs and white stone and the agora begins its drowsy transformation, you realize public napping in ancient Greece was not weird. It was climate, culture, architecture, and biology quietly shaking hands. And you, sweating gently in borrowed linen, are just smart enough to close your eyes before noon turns you into historical jerky. Section 2. By the time your eyes reopen, not fully asleep, but pleasantly suspended in that strange half-dream where cicadas sound like tiny rattling machines built by Apollo, the sun has climbed with malicious confidence. Morning's golden glow is gone now, replaced by a white, flattening brilliance that makes marble glare like an accusation. You can practically feel your eyebrows heating. Ancient Greece, for all its philosophy and graceful pottery, is also deeply committed to reminding you that the Mediterranean climate does not care about your plans. You shift beneath the stoa's shade, grateful for every inch of shadow cast by those dignified columns. And here, perhaps more than anywhere else, you begin to understand one of the least glamorous but most important truths of ancient life. Civilization is often just humanity improvising ways not to overheat. The Greek world, especially mainland cities like Athens, could be punishingly hot for much of the year. Summers were dry, bright, and often unforgiving. Average daytime temperatures could soar, and without modern insulation, electric fans, or the blessed miracle of iced drinks, your options were fairly limited. You either adapted or you slowly transformed into a tragic cautionary vase painting. This is why shade was not decorative. It was survival. The Greeks built for light, yes, but also against it. Public architecture often incorporated colonnades, porticos, courtyards, and open-air designs that maximized airflow while minimizing direct solar assault. Stoas, those long-covered walkways bordering agoras and sanctuaries, were among the ancient world's greatest practical inventions. Think of them as part civic center, part shopping arcade, part political forum, and part emergency anti-sun bunker. One of the most famous examples, the Stoa Poikile in Athens, was known for its painted panels and philosophical gatherings. But beyond its artistic prestige, it also provided something less poetic and more immediately useful. Shade. Cool, glorious shade. The kind that makes you reconsider all your life choices while your sandals stop sticking to hot stone. Historians are still debating whether midday public rest in these spaces was fully formalized as custom or simply a widespread response to environmental pressure. But either way, the result was clear. Greek cities developed rhythms shaped by heat, and heat shapes behavior in ways modern air conditioning has made many people forget. You notice how the city subtly reorganizes itself. Vendors reposition goods beneath awnings, amphorae are moved where clay can stay cooler, animals cluster near fountains or walls, conversations become shorter, more economical, as though every unnecessary syllable risks dehydration. Even the famously argumentative Athenians, who could debate politics like caffeinated law students, seem slightly less enthusiastic under direct noon fire. It's oddly comforting. Human beings, separated by millennia, remain united by one timeless instinct. When it's too hot, absolutely nobody wants to do extra work. The Greeks had clever methods beyond architecture, too. Clothing helped. Lightweight tunics, often linen or light wool, allowed airflow, though by modern standards you may still feel like you've been gift-wrapped in breathable regret. Wide-brimmed hats were not common daily wear for all, but head coverings and cloaks could be improvised. Water sources, fountains, and shaded groves were essential parts of urban and rural life alike. And then there were trees, especially olives. Now, olive trees are not exactly towering oaks with cathedral-like canopies. They are twisted, silvery, often modest providers of patchy shade. But in a world where every degree matters, even partial protection is sacred. Beneath olive groves outside cities or near gymnasiums, people could rest, converse, or simply wait out the harshest sunlight. It's less luxury retreat and more, please let this branch save me. One lesser-known fact is that some sanctuaries and temple precincts also offered cool refuges, though obviously you'd want to avoid looking disrespectful while sprawled near sacred architecture like a sunburned tourist. Religious spaces were often located with environmental awareness, and groves associated with gods could be literal and spiritual shelter. You begin to realize that Greek daily life was less about conquering nature and more about negotiating with it. This was not Rome's later obsession with imposing infrastructure at colossal scale. Greek adaptation often felt more intimate, working with terrain, breeze, orientation, and timing. Afternoons were not dead time, they were recalibrated time. Some work continued, especially for laborers, artisans, and enslaved individuals who had fewer choices. But for many, particularly citizens with social flexibility, midday heat encouraged slower rhythms. This included sitting, talking, observing, and yes, sleeping. And here's where modern hustle culture would absolutely lose its mind. Imagine telling a productivity guru that one of history's most intellectually influential societies understood strategic daytime rest. The same civilization that gave you Plato, geometry, formal drama, and foundational political thought also collectively understood that maybe your brain functions better when it's not boiling. There's also food to consider. Greek diets, bread, olives, wine, figs, cheese were nourishing, but often modest. Midday meals could be light, but even light food under heavy heat can trigger drowsiness. Add diluted wine, because Greeks commonly mixed wine with water, and suddenly your brief reflective pause becomes accidentally asleep near a column. Not that anyone would necessarily judge too harshly, assuming you weren't snoring like a sacrificial goat. The sounds around you soften further. Sandals scrape less frequently now. Somewhere nearby, water drips from a fountain basin with hypnotic steadiness. A merchant dozes upright with a level of neck control modern commuters would envy. Children's noise fades indoors. Heat presses down not violently but insistently, like a giant warm hand saying, maybe sit down, and so you do. Leaning against sun-warmed stone that somehow still feels cooler than the open square, you sense why public rest became natural. Not laziness, not indulgence, alignment. This climate, this architecture, this society, all gently conspire toward pauses. The strange thing is how sophisticated it feels. Not because napping itself is sophisticated, though frankly it deserves more respect, but because an entire culture can reveal itself through its pauses as much as through its monuments. The Greeks did not simply build temples to Athena. They also built shaded edges where ordinary bodies could endure ordinary days. So while history often hands you marble heroes frozen mid-speech, the truth is softer. Many ancient Greeks were just trying to stay cool, avoid heat exhaustion, and maybe steal 20 blessed minutes of unconsciousness before discussing virtue again. And under this brilliant, relentless sky, honestly, that may be the wisest philosophy yet. Section 3. As the day stretches lazily over Athens, and the air itself seems to shimmer like hot oil on bronze, you begin to notice something that no marble statue or dramatic history scroll quite prepares you for. Respectable public idleness can look surprisingly sophisticated when everyone is wearing sandals and discussing virtue. Beneath the stoa, in patches of drifting shade, men gather not only to trade or debate, but to recline with an ease that would make modern office workers weep softly into ergonomic chairs. This is where you start to understand that for many free male citizens of ancient Greece, particularly in democratic city-states like Athens, the public square was more than a workplace or marketplace. It was in many ways an extension of the self. To exist publicly was to participate in civic life. To be seen in the agora was to signal engagement, identity, and social legitimacy. You didn't simply go out, you inhabited the polis. And that included moments of conversation, reflection, argument, loafing, and yes, strategic napping. Now, before your modern brain imagines a giant civic sleepover with everyone curled up in synchronized philosophical slumber, let's be clear. Public sleep was shaped by status, context, and practicality. But among citizens who had the privilege of controlling portions of their day, resting in communal spaces, especially during oppressive heat, could be entirely unremarkable. The Greeks even had a concept that brushes intriguingly close to this balance, schola. While often translated as leisure, it did not mean laziness in the modern sense. Schole implied free time used for thought, discussion, learning, or contemplation. In fact, the English word school comes from it, which is honestly hilarious when you remember most students would define school as the opposite of leisure. Still, the point matters. Free time for privileged Greek men was culturally significant. So picture yourself among them. You are seated on a low stone bench, the surface smooth from generations of use. Nearby, an older man with a beard, impressive enough to deserve its own municipal title, has loosened his posture into something between dignified repose and accidental unconsciousness. A merchant, having sold enough olive oil for the morning, stretches out his legs and closes his eyes for what he would absolutely insist is meditative economic recalibration. And no one panics. This is partly because public spaces in Greece often blurred categories. Modern societies separate more rigidly. Business, philosophy, politics, religion, exercise, and social life all overlapped. The agora was multifunctional, so a pause within it was not necessarily abandonment of duty. Sometimes it was simply pacing yourself within the rhythms of the city. One widely recognized historical reality is that Athenian democracy required participation from citizens. Assemblies, juries, military obligations, festivals, public life could be demanding, but demand did not mean constant motion. In fact, periods of waiting were built into civic structures, waiting for speeches, votes, trials, transactions, ceremonies, and humans, being humans, have always found creative uses for waiting. Sometimes that use is talking, sometimes it is staring thoughtfully, and sometimes it is drooling very slightly onto your hymation. A curious lesser-known detail is that some legal and civic processes could involve extended stretches of public presence, especially for those engaged in bureaucratic or judicial systems. Shade, seating, and patience became critical. Historians are still debating whether references to visible rest among citizens reflect broader social norms or specific situational necessity, but either way, daily public life clearly included intervals of lowered activity. Then there were philosophers, who may have elevated public lingering into a competitive art form. Imagine wandering past a cluster of students listening to someone explain ethics while another thinker nearby appears to be asleep. Is he resting? Is he meditating? Is he crafting a devastating critique of conventional morality? Hard to say. In Greece, all three remained possible. This blending of thought and stillness mattered. Greek intellectual culture often prized observation and dialogue over frantic productivity. You don't invent major schools of philosophy by answering emails every 6 minutes. Reflection requires time, and time occasionally requires lying down near a column before your sandals fuse to the pavement. Of course, privilege is the key ingredient here, and it would be deeply unfair to imagine all Greeks enjoyed equal access to leisurely afternoons. Women's public movement was often more restricted depending on city and status, while enslaved people and laborers harsher realities. But for free men, especially those with moderate means, public rest could function almost like a civic punctuation mark. You also notice how appearance matters. Public sleep is not necessarily sprawling chaos. A cloak folded correctly can preserve dignity. Resting while seated or leaning may look contemplative rather than vulnerable. Ancient Greeks, like many societies, cared deeply about presentation. Even your nap could probably benefit from posture. It's strangely familiar, really. Today, people nap in airports, trains, offices, and libraries, often pretending they are just resting their eyes. Ancient Greeks may not have had commuter rail, but they absolutely understood the social art of being tired without fully surrendering your reputation. And while some comic playwrights poked fun at laziness, as Aristophanes certainly enjoyed mocking human foolishness, rest itself was not inherently shameful. Excess, perhaps. Uselessness, maybe. But sensible adaptation? Entirely different. You begin to see that these men, lounging in partial shade with sandals kicked slightly loose, are not rejecting society. They are participating in it according to its tempo. The city pulses, then softens, then pulses again. This rhythm is everything. In a world without fluorescent office lights or rigid industrial schedules, the day bends more naturally around environment. Heat rises, bodies slow, shade becomes social currency. Then later, when the sun relents, life surges back with renewed force. And maybe that's the real genius here. Not just democracy or philosophy or architecture, but timing. Ancient Greek public life often allowed a degree of temporal flexibility that many modern systems have bulldozed in favor of constant output. The Greeks, for all their contradictions, understood something beautifully obvious. A citizen overheated and exhausted is unlikely to produce brilliant rhetoric. So here in the agora, among sandals, figs, politics, and low murmurs, you witness a culture where rest is woven into visibility itself. Not everyone can afford it. Not everyone experiences it equally. But for those who can, a public nap is not failure. It is rhythm. It is adaptation. It is citizenship, reclining slightly. And as your own eyelids grow heavy once more beneath the blessed geometry of shade, you may finally accept that ancient Greece was not merely the birthplace of Western thought. It was also, in its sun-drenched wisdom, quietly excellent at knowing when to sit down. Section 4. Of course, as your pleasantly drowsy imagination wanders through these shaded colonnades full of reclining citizens and beard-stroking philosophers, history gently clears its throat and reminds you that ancient Greece was not one giant sun-soaked leisure club where everyone enjoyed equal rights, equal naps, and equal access to figs. Because while some citizens stretched in the agora discussing virtue, like toga-wrapped podcasters, much of Greek society was powered by people whose relationship with midday exhaustion was significantly less poetic. You begin to drift away from the polished civic center now, leaving behind marble, rhetoric, and carefully arranged dignity, and moving instead toward workshops, farms, kitchens, docks, laundries, and construction sites, the places where bodies worked because society demanded it. And here, under the same scorching sun, rest looks different. Ancient Greece depended heavily on labor from enslaved people, hired workers, artisans, servants, agricultural laborers, and women managing domestic households. This is one of the broad, undeniable truths of Greek civilization. Its celebrated intellectual and political achievements often rested on deeply unequal social foundations. Democracy for some, backbreaking necessity for many others. A little awkward for the tourism brochure, perhaps, but historically essential. You step onto a dusty road outside the city where farmers rise before dawn because the land, unlike philosophers, does not reward oversleeping. Olive groves, vineyards, grain plots, these require relentless timing. Workers often began early, specifically to avoid the worst afternoon heat, but labor rarely vanished just because the sun became rude. Still, climate remains the great equalizer. Even the hardest overseer cannot fully argue with biology when temperatures climb. Across rural and urban settings alike, practical pauses often emerge because heat physically limited endurance. Historians are still debating how standardized midday rest may have been across classes and regions, but environmental pressure strongly suggests adaptation was widespread, even when conditions differed dramatically by status. So yes, laborers rested too, but often from necessity rather than cultivated leisure. Picture a potter in a workshop, hands caked with clay, pausing not for philosophical reflection, but because the kiln is hot enough already without adding your own spontaneous combustion. Or rowers by a harbor, shoulders burning, seeking whatever shade a cargo stack provides. Or women grinding grain indoors where stone walls may offer some relief, though domestic labor, tragically, has never respected office hours. And this is where the ancient world becomes both familiar and frustrating. Because then, as now, your experience of rest often depends on who controls your time. Enslaved people in Greece occupied vastly different roles depending on household, region, and owner, but many faced exhausting labor with little autonomy. Some domestic servants may have had access to intermittent breaks shaped by household rhythms, while miners, particularly in brutal places like Lorient silver mines, lived under far harsher realities. If you think your current work emails are soul-draining, ancient mining might recalibrate your perspective immediately. A lesser-known fact is that Greek silver mining, crucial to Athenian wealth and military power, often relied on enslaved labor under appalling conditions. Underground heat, cramped spaces, and physical danger made public naps in scenic plazas feel like a very exclusive perk indeed. Yet above ground, among craftspeople and manual workers, adaptation still mattered. Shade structures, meal breaks, and reduced intensity during peak heat were practical strategies. Humans, regardless of status, are made of flesh, not bronze statuary. You may notice, too, that Greek comedy and literature occasionally reflect awareness of class distinctions in work and exhaustion. Aristophanes, for example, loved satirizing labor, idleness, and social absurdity. Even jokes about laziness often reveal an underlying cultural understanding that work, rest, and status were deeply entangled. And then there are household women, whose labor can be especially invisible in grand historical narratives. In many Greek households, especially wealthier ones, women oversaw domestic economies, weaving, food preparation, child rearing, servant management. Their midday rhythms were shaped less by public squares and more by enclosed spaces. Indoor architecture sometimes offered cooler zones, courtyards, and shaded rooms, but domestic obligations could be relentless. You are beginning to suspect that history's obsession with male philosophers occasionally forgot who was making sure anyone had clean tunics. To be fair, some elite women likely experienced periods of rest, but gender norms often restricted public leisure differently than for men. Public napping in the agora was not exactly marketed as an inclusive lifestyle brand, and so the Greek world reveals itself more honestly, not as one uniform cultural pattern, but as overlapping experiences shaped by class, gender, and labor. Still, what remains remarkable is how climate threads through all of it. Whether citizen or servant, merchant or mason, everyone negotiated the same burning sky. A free man might recline beneath a painted stoa discussing ethics. A laborer might crouch beneath a cart for 15 stolen minutes of shade. The difference is profound, but the sun remains equally aggressive. You can't help noticing how ancient cities themselves reflected this reality. Workshops clustered where airflow helped. Domestic spaces used courtyards strategically. Public fountains became communal anchors. Even modest architecture often prioritized cooling in ways that modern glass towers occasionally seem to have forgotten entirely. And despite inequality, there is a strange democratic force in heat stroke prevention. Eventually, everyone seeks relief. Some workers likely ate simple midday meals, bread, onions, olives, watered wine, and paused briefly. Not luxury, not skole, just bodily negotiation. Survival with crumbs. 3 hours in, your modern fantasy of living in ancient Greece is probably fading fast. Sure, philosophy sounds lovely until you realize someone still has to haul water, weave cloth, harvest barley, and not die of sun exposure. You'd likely last one afternoon before begging for sunscreen and labor laws. But perhaps that's why this broader view matters. Because the history of public napping is not merely about quirky Greeks snoozing in scenic plazas. It's about how entire societies respond to environment under unequal conditions. Rest becomes privilege, necessity, adaptation, or stolen opportunity, depending on who you are. The agora's shaded dream remains real. So does the workshop's sweat. So does the field's exhaustion. And as the cicadas drone on above farms, rooftops, and stone streets alike, you realize ancient Greece was never one story. It was many bodies beneath one sun, each finding whatever pause they could. Some on marble benches, some under olive branches, some against rough walls with aching backs, all of them in one way or another listening for the rare mercy of moving air. Section 5. And as the heat presses down with that slow, dreamy insistence that makes your limbs feel heavier than freshly carved stone, something curious begins to happen in your half-drowsy ancient imagination. Sleep itself starts to feel less like a bodily inconvenience and more like a doorway. Because in ancient Greece, rest was never entirely just rest. Not when your world is full of gods who meddle, whisper, disguise themselves as livestock when necessary, and occasionally turn your life upside down over fairly minor dramatic misunderstandings. You've now spent enough time beneath colonnades and olive trees to appreciate practical napping, but Greek culture, being gloriously incapable of leaving anything entirely ordinary, also wrapped sleep in myth, ritual, symbolism, and divine possibility. A midday doze might still be about escaping heat stroke, certainly, but it could also brush against a much larger cultural landscape filled with dreams, omens, and supernatural interpretation. So naturally, your nap may now come with theological subtext. The Greeks personified sleep itself in the figure of Hypnos, the god of sleep, often imagined as a gentle winged being who moved silently over land and sea. Hypnos was no terrifying monster. He was soft, inevitable, and strangely elegant, the divine embodiment of that exact moment when your eyes betray your ambitions after lunch. His twin brother, Thanatos, was death, which sounds alarmingly intense until you remember ancient mythology absolutely loved dramatic family structures. Sleep and death as siblings reflected a broader Greek fascination with altered states of consciousness, vulnerability, and the boundary between worlds. Honestly, if your sibling rivalry involves one of you being a nap and the other being mortality, family dinners are probably complicated. Hypnos lived, according to myth, in a shadowy cave where the sun never shone, surrounded by poppies and soothing sounds of water. Its less grim underworld and more luxury blackout retreat for exhausted immortals. This imagery reveals something profound. The Greeks often viewed sleep as sacred, restorative, and mysterious. Not simply passive, dreams too carried significance. Through anoroi, the dream spirits, messages could pass from divine realms into human minds. Some dreams were nonsense, of course, likely the result of too much diluted wine and goat cheese, but others were taken seriously, especially vivid or unusual dreams that might signal divine warning, prophecy, or psychological revelation. Historians are still debating how ordinary Greeks distinguished meaningful dreams from ordinary mental chaos, but literary and religious traditions clearly show that dreams could hold cultural weight. Take Homer, for example. In the Iliad and Odyssey, dreams are not random cinematic filler. Gods use them. Heroes receive them. Sometimes they mislead, which frankly feels extremely realistic. Zeus himself sends deceptive dreams when it suits him, proving once again that even divine communication occasionally resembles suspicious group chat misinformation. As you recline beneath a shady stoa, your own brief afternoon sleep might not officially qualify as sacred prophecy, but in a society steeped in myth, sleep carried symbolic possibility. And then there were healing sanctuaries. One of the stranger and genuinely fascinating lesser-known practices in Greek culture involved incubation rituals at temples of Asclepius, god of medicine. People seeking healing sometimes slept in sacred precincts, hoping divine dreams would offer cures or guidance. These sanctuaries functioned as proto-medical centers, mixed with spiritual retreats, where sleep itself became treatment. Imagine checking into a hospital and being told your primary care plan involves napping near snakes and hoping for symbolic dream advice. Surprisingly for many, this felt entirely reasonable. At Epidaurus, perhaps the most famous healing sanctuary, patients underwent ritual purification before sleeping in designated spaces. Priests interpreted dreams, and cures were sometimes recorded. Whether these experiences were divine, psychosomatic, or a blend of ritual and environment, they reveal a Greek understanding of sleep as potentially transformative. So while your average merchant napping after figs may not be expecting Apollo Care Plus coverage, the broader culture gave sleep layers of meaning beyond biology. You begin to understand that public sleeping in ancient Greece existed on a spectrum. At one end, practical shade naps because the sun is a tyrant. At the other, sacred sleep as divine encounter. And somewhere in the middle, a philosopher insisting his nap was actually metaphysical research. Greek literature also linked dreams with emotional truth. In tragedy, dreams could foreshadow doom or reveal guilt. In everyday life, they might stir anxieties or hopes. Sleep was a vulnerable state, one in which control softened and unseen forces, whether divine or internal, could emerge. This may explain why sleeping spaces, public or private, were culturally textured. A nap in the agora was practical, yes, but full sleep often carried greater symbolic resonance. Even so, the midday rest you've been exploring sits comfortably within this larger worldview. Greeks did not necessarily separate body and spirit as rigidly as some modern frameworks do. Physical states, hunger, exhaustion, ecstasy, dreaming, could all intersect with philosophy, medicine, or religion, and there's something beautifully human about that. Because lying beneath an olive tree, half awake, listening to leaves rustle while sunlight flickers against your eyelids, it's not hard to see why ancient people might feel close to something larger. Heat haze itself can feel supernatural if you're dehydrated enough. You chuckle quietly imagining a modern productivity app trying to quantify all this. Congratulations! You achieved 23 minutes of divine semi-consciousness. Zeus may contact you shortly. But beneath the humor lies an important truth. Ancient Greek sleep culture was never purely mechanical. The same civilization that analyzed geometry also believed dreams might matter. The same people who built stoas for shade also told stories of winged sleep gods. Practicality and myth did not cancel each other out. They coexisted. So as afternoon deepens and your own mind drifts somewhere between civic noise and cicada song, you are participating in something larger than a heat break. You are entering a culture where sleep is body maintenance, social adaptation, divine symbol, and poetic mystery all at once. A place where closing your eyes in public might simply mean you're tired, or perhaps, just perhaps, Hypnos himself has brushed your brow. Either way, in this shimmering world of marble, dust, and gods, even your nap feels storied. Section 6. And somewhere between the soft tyranny of heat, the rustle of olive leaves, and Hypnos politely hovering over your increasingly heavy eyelids, you may begin to suspect that ancient Greek thinkers, those famously restless architects of philosophy, must surely have transcended such ordinary bodily concerns as public drowsiness. Surely Socrates never nodded off against a column. Surely Plato didn't pause mid-ideal form. Surely the great minds of Greece operated like immortal caffeine engines. Well, probably not. Because the more closely you wander through the lived texture of Greek intellectual life, the more obvious it becomes that philosophers, teachers, cynics, and wandering thinkers were still gloriously, inconveniently human. They sweated, sat, lounged, argued, ate, and likely appreciated shade with the same desperation as everyone else. In fact, some of them practically turned public stillness into an art form. Take Socrates, for instance, that barefoot, endlessly questioning Athenian icon whose reputation often arrives wrapped in marble seriousness. Socrates spent much of his life in public spaces, engaging fellow citizens in dialogue, debate, and relentless conversational ambush. He frequented agoras, gymnasiums, workshops, wherever people gathered. One of the best-known facts about him is that he taught not in formal classrooms, but through public engagement. Now imagine that life for a moment. You spend all day outdoors in Athens, interrogating people about justice, virtue, courage, and whether they truly understand sandals on a metaphysical level. At some point, you are absolutely going to need to sit down. Ancient sources often emphasize Socrates' physical endurance, simplicity, and tolerance for discomfort, but even this near-legendary public thinker existed inside a climate. Historians are still debating how much literary portrayals exaggerate his ascetic toughness, yet no philosophical reputation can fully cancel biology. And then there's Diogenes. Ah yes, Diogenes, the glorious menace of Greek philosophy, patron saint of public weirdness, and perhaps history's most committed practitioner of, I reject your social norms and also your furniture. Though technically associated more with later Cynic traditions, Diogenes became legendary for living with radical simplicity, allegedly residing in a large storage jar or tub, and embracing public life with astonishing disregard for convention. This is a man who reportedly ate, slept, lectured, and insulted people with breathtaking civic openness. If public napping had a chaotic neutral mascot, Diogenes may be your winner. He famously challenged status, comfort, and artificiality, proving that sometimes philosophical enlightenment looks suspiciously like aggressive loitering. One lesser-known truth is that cynics used public behavior intentionally, turning everyday acts into critiques of social pretense. Resting publicly, therefore, could become more than practical. It could be philosophical theater. Picture him stretched in partial shade, entirely unbothered, while nearby Athenians debate whether he's a genius, a menace, or both. Frankly, the answer may be yes. Then you move to Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, more structured intellectual environments, certainly, but still deeply connected to walking, talking, and open-air learning. Aristotle's school, in particular, gave rise to the peripatetics, named for walking discussions, which sounds elegant until you remember this is ancient Greece, and walking discussion in summer heat could quickly become philosophical sweating. So yes, even elevated intellectual life remained physically grounded. Greek philosophy often centered on balance, moderation, bodily awareness, and human flourishing. Schools differed, of course. Stoics later prized endurance. Epicureans sought tranquility. Cynics mocked excess. But none of these traditions emerged from people floating above physical reality like abstract thought balloons. They lived in cities. They sat in shade. They navigated weather. And perhaps most beautifully, many philosophical traditions treated rest, contemplation, and withdrawal from frenzy as intellectually valuable. Schola, again, matters here. Leisure was not necessarily empty idleness. It created space for reflection. You do not formulate ethical systems while speed-running errands under solar assault. There's a subtle but profound connection between public rest and Greek thought. Civilization's greatest questions often require pauses. Modern life, with its compulsive notifications and suspicious obsession with productivity metrics, may find this deeply inconvenient. But ancient Greece repeatedly suggests that thought thrives not only in action, but in intervals. You sit now near a teacher speaking softly to students beneath a grove. Some listen attentively. One may absolutely be asleep. Another appears contemplative, though honestly the line between wisdom and heat exhaustion remains thin. And nobody necessarily separates these states as sharply as you might. A fascinating lesser-known point is that many philosophical gatherings took place in gymnasiums, spaces combining exercise, education, and social interaction. These were not isolated classrooms, but dynamic civic environments where physical and intellectual life intertwined. Rest after exercise, pauses in shade, conversations reclining against pillars, these likely formed part of broader daily rhythms. Even symposium culture, though more associated with evening drinking parties, reinforces the Greek comfort with reclining as a mode of intellectual and social engagement. Greeks often literally lay down while discussing ideas over wine. Somewhere, modern ergonomic designers are taking notes. And while historians are still debating how idealized these portrayals can be, Greek cultural patterns consistently reveal less anxiety about stillness than many later productivity-obsessed systems. To pause was not always to fail. To recline was not always to surrender. To sit in public was not inherently suspicious. Imagine introducing Diogenes to a corporate time management seminar. Within minutes, someone's motivational whiteboard would be overturned. Yet beneath the jokes, there's a gentle revelation unfolding. These thinkers, whether disciplined, eccentric, or delightfully impossible, were embedded in the same sensory world as everyone else. Dust clung to feet, sunburned skin, shade mattered, bodies required care. So perhaps ancient philosophy was not only born from towering intellect, but also from practical moments when someone sat beneath a colonnade escaping heat and finally had enough quiet to ask, what actually matters? Not while sprinting, not while scrolling, not while optimizing, but while resting. And as afternoon hum deepens around you, while cicadas chant their endless metallic hymn and white stone radiates fading warmth, you can almost picture it. A philosopher leaning back, eyes half closed, not lazy, not absent, just thinking, very horizontally. Section 7 by now. As your sandals have collected enough dust to qualify as minor archaeological artifacts, and your sense of time has softened into the gentle rise and fall of sun, shade, and cicadas, you begin to notice that ancient Greek public rest was not confined to philosophers, merchants, or opportunistic men leaning artistically against columns. No, even the most physically disciplined corners of Greek society, the runners, wrestlers, soldiers, and gloriously oiled athletes, understood something essential. The human body, no matter how heroic, occasionally needs to stop behaving like a bronze statue and lie down. And nowhere is this clearer than in the gymnasium. Now, if the word gymnasium makes you picture fluorescent treadmills, awkward mirrors, and someone loudly dropping weights for attention, gently release that image into the Aegean breeze. The ancient Greek gymnasium was a far richer civic institution, part training ground, part school, part social hub, part philosophical hangout, and occasionally part sweat festival. Greek physical culture was famously central to identity, especially for free men. Athletic excellence, military preparedness, and bodily cultivation were deeply admired. The Olympic Games, first traditionally dated to 776 BCE, remain one of the best-known symbols of this obsession. But beyond the spectacle of elite competition, everyday exercise and physical education shaped broader life. And exercise, as you may have personally discovered after climbing exactly one staircase too enthusiastically, produces fatigue. So there you are now, entering a gymnasium courtyard where young men train under open skies. Bodies gleam with olive oil, dust clings to limbs, and trainers bark instructions with all the timeless energy of coaches who believe volume itself builds character. Wrestlers grapple, runners pant, discus throwers rehearse elegant violence, and then recovery. You may be surprised how sophisticated Greek approaches to physical recovery could be. Rest, bathing, massage, and strategic pacing all played roles in athletic life. Olive oil was not just for salads and diplomacy, it was used on the body for conditioning, cleansing, and ritualized care. After exertion, athletes often scraped off oil, sweat, and dirt with a strigil, which sounds glamorous until you realize it's basically an ancient skincare routine involving competitive grime removal. One lesser-known fact is that scraped-off athletic residue called gloios was sometimes bizarrely collected and sold for medicinal or cosmetic purposes. Yes, that means someone looked at sweaty dust paste and thought, health product. History can be deeply unsettling, but beneath the oddities lies an important truth. Greek athletic culture recognized recovery as necessary. This extended beyond sport into military life. In city-states like Athens and especially Sparta, physical endurance mattered enormously. Soldiers marched, drilled, trained, and fought under harsh conditions. Yet armies throughout history have always depended not only on discipline, but on rhythm, movement balanced by pause. Historians are still debating the precise structures of rest and downtime within various Greek military systems, especially between different city-states, but no fighting force can function indefinitely without recovery. Even Spartan severity, for all its terrifying reputation, could not entirely abolish sleep without accidentally inventing collapse. In fact, Greek military encampments often required strategic timing around weather, terrain, and daylight. Marching under peak heat could be dangerous. Midday pauses, shade opportunities, and water access mattered. This is where your romantic image of ancient warriors dramatically changes. Yes, hoplites were brave. Yes, they wore armor. But bronze helmets under Mediterranean sun? Congratulations, you are now a roasted concept. So practical rest wasn't weakness, it was logistics. Back in the gymnasium, however, rest carries a slightly more civilized tone. You sit beneath a shaded portico as exhausted trainees breathe heavily nearby, their conversations drifting from competition to politics to whose sandals smell the worst. Greek educational systems often integrated intellectual and physical cultivation, so gymnasiums became places where philosophy and athletics intertwined. This means that after wrestling in dust, you might discuss ethics. Honestly, that level of ambition feels exhausting on its own. The Greek ideal of kalokagathia, a concept loosely connecting physical beauty with moral goodness, suggested that body and mind were linked. To train the body well was, in some frameworks, connected to broader excellence. Yet this ideal did not imply nonstop exertion. Proper rhythm, discipline, and restoration mattered too. You watch an older trainer demonstrate pacing. Too much strain invites injury. Too little effort weakens capacity. Once again, Greek culture circles back to moderation. Nothing in excess, not even abs. And this balanced understanding may help explain why public spaces connected to exercise often included shaded areas, colonnades, and social zones. Recovery was built into the environment, Cooling down wasn't a guilty secret, it was part of the system. Bathhouses, though not yet the massive Roman complexes that would later dominate Mediterranean urban luxury, also played roles in bodily maintenance. Water, cleansing, and temperature regulation mattered. And then there's the simple, universal beauty of post-exercise exhaustion. That moment when your muscles stop arguing and your body enters blissful heaviness, that deep, involuntary sigh, that temptation to immediately nap on the nearest flat surface. Ancient Greeks absolutely knew this feeling. Whether you were an athlete recovering from pankration, a terrifying combat sport that was essentially what-if wrestling but with more consequences, or a young trainee finishing drills, the body demanded pause, publicly, naturally, without apology. Modern society often packages rest as reward after productivity, but Greek systems frequently embedded it within performance itself. Rest was not always separate from excellence. Sometimes it enabled excellence. This is an important distinction, because here, under fig trees and colonnades near exercise grounds, you see that even highly disciplined cultures recognize bodily limits. There's something deeply reassuring about this. Civilization did not advance because humans ignored fatigue. It advanced partly because they learned to work with it. You chuckle imagining a Spartan fitness influencer shouting, "No days off," while immediately feigning in full armor by noon. No, ancient Greece, despite all its heroics, remained bound to flesh. So as afternoon settles over the gymnasium and a warm breeze carries the scent of dust, oil, and crushed herbs, young athletes stretch out in patches of shade. Some speak softly. Some close their eyes. Some pretend not to be tired with exactly the same doomed pride seen in modern teenagers everywhere. And you, resting among them, realize that whether in agora, grove, or training yard, the Greek world repeatedly returns to one elegant truth. To endure, you must recover. Even heroes, however polished in marble, occasionally needed a nap. Section 8. And so, with your muscles pleasantly imaginary sore from watching other people exercise, which is honestly the noblest kind of athletic fatigue, you drift once more toward the agora, that endlessly adaptable civic stage where nearly every part of Greek life somehow collides beneath one sun. By now, the square feels familiar. You know its rhythms better. Morning urgency, midday surrender, afternoon revival. But what becomes increasingly fascinating is how this place, so often celebrated as the birthplace of democracy and philosophical inquiry, is also occasionally a place where someone definitely falls asleep halfway through public discourse, which, if we're being fair, has happened in political settings across all centuries. The agora was not merely a market, it was a civic organism. Here, citizens discussed policy, heard announcements, bought fish, criticized generals, admired pottery, spread rumors, and performed the deeply ancient human ritual of pretending to be busier than they actually were. And because Greek civic life prized participation, especially in democratic Athens, public spaces could become crowded, noisy, and mentally exhausting. Imagine spending hours listening to speeches, legal disputes, or policy debates while standing on hot stone under a bright sky. Suddenly, that shady corner near a fountain starts looking less like laziness and more like constitutional self-preservation. One of the most famous features of Athenian democracy was direct citizen involvement. Eligible male citizens could attend assemblies, vote, serve on juries, and engage publicly. This was revolutionary in many ways, but also deeply time-consuming. Participation required presence. Presence required stamina, and stamina, inconveniently, is finite. So yes, the city of lofty ideals also required practical pauses. You can almost hear it now. A politician in full rhetorical flourish, passionately denouncing corruption, while 3 rows back someone subtly shifts from careful listening posture into brief horizontal reconsideration of consciousness. Historians are still debating how often overt public sleeping occurred during civic proceedings versus more casual agora life, but waiting and lingering were undeniably central features of public participation. Legal cases could be lengthy, administrative tasks could drag, crowds gathered, time stretched, and humans, as always, adapted. Shade again becomes your greatest ally. Stoas around the agora weren't just architectural elegance, they provided shelter for commerce, conversation, and delay. Citizens could remain near the action without physically melting. This duality is strangely beautiful. Democracy in sunlight, napping in shadow. The Greeks, despite their reverence for civic life, did not construct every public function as relentless intensity. There were natural ebbs. Public life included observation, waiting, socializing, and pauses between formal moments. Not every minute in the agora was a thunderous oration. Sometimes, frankly, it was administrative boredom, and boredom has always been fertile ground for drowsiness. A lesser-known fact is that some public officials in Athens were selected by lot rather than election, reflecting a fascinating commitment to civic distribution. This meant ordinary citizens could find themselves entangled in bureaucratic functions they may or may not have found thrilling, which raises the delightful possibility that somewhere in history, a randomly selected administrator absolutely fought for his life against a post-lunch nap. Nearby, traders spread goods beneath awnings, pottery glints softly, fish sellers remain aggressively awake, largely because fish has deadlines. Philosophers cluster, craftsmen negotiate, children weave unpredictably through adults with the eternal energy of small beings immune to historical atmosphere, and among it all, public stillness persists. Not dramatic sleep, not theatrical collapse, but pauses. A man seated on a bench, eyes closed, an elder beneath a tree, a traveler resting near baggage, a juror leaning against cool stone, preserving energy for civic obligation. This is not disengagement. Often it is endurance. Modern assumptions can be misleading here. We tend to imagine important societies as perpetually active, as though civilization only counts when everyone is visibly straining. But the agora reveals another possibility. Significance can coexist with intervals. In fact, those intervals may be essential. Political thought itself requires reflection. Decisions improve when minds are not boiled. Public discourse ideally benefits from citizens who are conscious enough to distinguish policy from nonsense. Though, to be fair, every era struggles with that last part. Greek comedy often satirized public life, exposing hypocrisy, vanity, and bureaucratic absurdity. Aristophanes in particular delighted in mocking politicians and institutions. This tells you something crucial. Greeks were not blindly reverent about civic spaces. They recognized public life as messy, flawed, and occasionally ridiculous, which makes the image of a man discreetly napping near a heated debate feel almost poetic. You start to appreciate the agora not just as the birthplace of grand ideals, but as a profoundly human environment, equal parts aspiration and exhaustion. And there's another subtlety here. Being publicly at rest could still signify social belonging. To occupy civic space mattered. To remain present mattered. Even if you weren't constantly speaking. There's something quietly democratic about shared physical presence, even in silence. A body in the square is still part of the city's pulse. Of course, exclusions remain profound. Women, enslaved people, foreigners often experience these spaces differently. Greek democracy was historically groundbreaking and deeply limited all at once. But within its citizen framework, public life allowed a spectrum of engagement wider than nonstop performance. As the afternoon breeze finally stirs dust and tunics alike, the square begins to revive. Vendors sharpen attention, conversations rise, more footsteps echo. Those who rested now rejoin activity. And here, perhaps, lies the true genius. Public rest was not separate from civic life. It was folded into it, like punctuation in a long sentence, like silence in music, like muting a very loud group chat before returning with your sanity intact. So while statues may immortalize speeches and battles, the real agora likely included softer scenes too. Ordinary citizens adjusting sandals, cooling foreheads, sipping watered wine, and occasionally surrendering to the undeniable logic of shade. You smile now, seated beneath a familiar column, as nearby democracy hums itself onward. Votes may shape the polis, words may define philosophy. But somewhere beneath it all, public life still depends on one humble truth. A well-timed nap may save civilization from becoming unbearably cranky. Section 9. And just when you think ancient Greece has already revealed all its grand secrets, its democracy, its philosophy, its architecture, its public lounging with suspiciously intellectual posture, you are gently but inevitably guided toward one of history's most powerful, least dramatic forces, lunch, or at least something close enough. Because if you really want to understand why ancient Greeks occasionally found themselves drifting toward midday sleep in public squares, gymnasiums, workshops, or olive shade, you cannot ignore the deeply persuasive alliance between heat, digestion, and watered wine. Civilizations may rise on ideals, but afternoons are often governed by stomachs. Now, ancient Greek eating habits varied by class, region, and circumstance, but for many people, daily meals were relatively simple compared to the banquet fantasies later painted in popular imagination. The average Greek diet often centered around bread or barley cakes, olives, figs, legumes, cheese, onions, and wine diluted with water. Fish appeared more commonly than meat for many coastal populations, while meat itself was often rarer outside sacrifice, festivals, or wealthier households. So no, your average Athenian was not crushing giant plates of roasted lamb at noon before collapsing dramatically into a feta coma. But even modest meals under Mediterranean heat can become profoundly sleep-inducing. Picture it now. You've spent the morning in the agora debating trade prices, pretending to understand philosophy, or carrying amphorae heavy enough to make your shoulders question existence. Then comes bread, perhaps coarse barley bread, maybe dipped in olive oil. A handful of figs, goat cheese, olives, perhaps lentils, watered wine. It sounds healthy, rustic, even Instagrammable in the right ceramic bowl. But then the sun hits, the body digests, the breeze softens, and suddenly Hypnos is back with excellent timing. One of the best-known aspects of Greek wine culture is that Greeks typically diluted wine with water, often in social settings. Drinking unmixed wine was widely considered uncivilized or excessive. Symposia, those famous drinking gatherings, usually happened later in the day, but diluted wine could accompany meals more broadly. This is important because while watered wine was weaker than modern expectations of drinking, it still contributed to relaxation. Add carbohydrates, physical heat, and exertion, and your body starts making very persuasive arguments for horizontal reflection. Historians are still debating precise meal timing and regional habits across the Greek world, but evidence strongly suggests daily rhythms aligned with climate and labor demands. Light morning intake, more substantial later meals, and adaptation around heat all likely varied. Yet the basic physiological reality remains timeless. Food plus heat equals drowsiness. You don't need a symposium to understand that. You just need functioning eyelids. A lesser-known culinary detail is the kykeon, a drink often made from barley and water, sometimes with herbs or additives depending on context. While famously associated with ritual in some cases, simple grain-based nourishment was practical too. Ancient diets were often deeply tied to sustenance and seasonality, not constant indulgence. And perhaps this simplicity itself shaped public life. Heavy industrial lunch breaks didn't exist. Fast food didn't exist. Drive-thrus definitely didn't exist, unless your donkey was exceptionally organized. Instead, food often folded naturally into slower rhythms. Eating could be communal, practical, and integrated with pauses. In markets, food vendors sold snacks and staples. Bread was foundational, olives portable, figs wonderfully efficient. Honestly, figs may have been one of history's earliest energy bars, just significantly squishier. As you sit beneath a tree with your modest meal, you begin to appreciate something subtle but profound. Ancient Greek food culture often encouraged pacing. There's no frantic desk lunch here, no swallowing something tragic while answering messages, no suspicious protein shake called mega Spartan fuel. You eat, you breathe, you digest, and then perhaps you rest. This pattern also intersects beautifully with medicine. Greek medical thought, particularly associated with figures like Hippocrates, emphasized balance, diet, environment, bodily states. Though humoral theory would later become more systematized, early Greek medicine already recognized that food, climate, and bodily rhythms mattered. Overeating, improper timing, or imbalance could affect health. So while your public nap might not officially count as physician-prescribed digestive optimization, the broader cultural framework was certainly attentive to bodily consequences. The body was not separate from daily philosophy. It was part of it. And then there are banquets and symposia, which, while more elite and evening-oriented, reveal another Greek truth. Reclining while consuming food or drink was culturally normalized in many social settings. Elite men often reclined during formal drinking gatherings, turning posture itself into social identity. This means ancient Greece did not merely tolerate horizontal digestion. In some settings, it practically ceremonialized it. You can't help admiring the elegance. Modern people often scarf meals while standing in parking lots. Greeks, flawed though they absolutely were, occasionally had the decency to architecturally support their digestion. Of course, class matters here too. A poor laborer's meal and a wealthy citizen's symposium differed dramatically. But across classes, midday nourishment under heat still shaped bodily experience. Even animals seem to understand this. Nearby goats lounge, dogs sleep, birdsong slows. The entire ecosystem appears to agree that after eating under a relentless sun, perhaps everyone should lower expectations, and this communal biological surrender is strangely charming. You begin to realize that ancient public napping wasn't always some grand cultural statement. Sometimes it was simply lunch, doing what lunch has always done, winning. So whether you are a merchant with breadcrumbs in your beard, an athlete cooling off after exercise, a philosopher pretending your closed eyes are conceptual, or a dock worker stealing 10 shaded minutes after onions and cheese, food becomes part of the rhythm. Eat, pause, resume, simple, human, remarkably enduring. As afternoon stretches on and your own meal settles pleasantly somewhere beneath borrowed linen, you lean back against warm stone and feel the square pulse softly around you. No one seems shocked, no one sounds alarms, no one accuses you of wasting your potential. Because here, in this sunlit civilization of olives, argument, and practical wisdom, sometimes the wisest thing a body can do after bread and wine is absolutely nothing for a little while. Section 10. And now, with breadcrumbs lingering somewhere in the folds of your borrowed tunic, watered wine settling into a pleasantly philosophical haze, and your understanding of ancient Greek life becoming increasingly suspicious of modern anti-nap propaganda, you start to notice something extraordinary hiding in plain sight. The Greeks didn't just accidentally nap in public. In many ways, they built worlds where public rest was possible. Not with neon signs reading "Recharge Zone," obviously. No scented meditation pods, no ergonomic beanbags shaped like lotus flowers. But through stone proportion, airflow, and civic design, ancient Greek architecture often created spaces where human beings could survive, gather, and occasionally drift off without immediately crisping under Apollo's enthusiastic daylight. This is where architecture stops being just columns and aesthetics and becomes climate strategy. By now, you already know the stoa, that glorious, shaded colonnade hugging public spaces like a thoughtful architectural shrug. But the more you move through Greek cities, the more you realize that stoas were not isolated conveniences. They were part of a larger pattern in urban planning that acknowledged weather, sunlight, and human movement. Greek cities, especially those shaped with intentional planning like Piraeus under Hippodamian influence, often considered orientation, breeze, and public functionality. Hippodamus of Miletus, sometimes called the father of urban planning, helped popularize grid systems and organize civic layouts. Historians are still debating how consistently environmental comfort factored into every design, but practical adaptation clearly mattered. And in a hot climate, practical adaptation often means one thing: shadow. You wander now through a network of porticos, courtyards, temple precincts, fountains, workshops, and narrow streets where sun and shade perform a daily dance across stone. White marble may dazzle, but limestone, plaster, wood, and clay all shape temperature differently. Covered walkways catch breezes, arcades soften glare, trees and sanctuaries create cool pockets. In short, the city itself has resting places. One lesser-known truth is that many sacred and civic spaces were deeply multisensory. Fountains were not merely decorative, they cooled air, supplied water, and provided acoustic relief. The sound of trickling water beneath heat can psychologically soften exhaustion, which means ancient Greeks may have accidentally invented proto-ASMR centuries before anyone whispered into microphones for internet fame. You stop beside a fountain house where women gather water and nearby travelers cool themselves. The air feels different here, moist, shaded, alive. Even a brief pause lowers the body's strain. And then there are courtyards. Greek domestic architecture often centered around internal courtyards, especially in wealthier homes. These spaces offered privacy, airflow, and moderated temperature. Public squares had their own analogs in open but structured civic design. Buildings were not sealed boxes trapping heat. They breathed. Modern skyscrapers occasionally behave like giant reflective ovens, but Greek builders, constrained by available technology and intimate environmental knowledge, often worked more cooperatively with local conditions. you're beginning to suspect ancient people may actually have understood sunlight better than office parks. Temple complexes, too, often occupied elevated or breezy sites. While not built as nap stations, these locations reveal awareness of environmental positioning. High places catch air, groves shelter movement, stone mass creates thermal variation, and perhaps most charmingly, steps themselves, those broad, sun-dappled stone platforms around civic and sacred structures, could become informal social zones. Sit here, wait there, lean here, recline if dignity permits. Public life was not always rigidly segmented. It flowed. This flexibility matters because when architecture offers thresholds, edges, covered transitions, and gathering zones, it naturally accommodates human variability, including fatigue. Imagine if every modern city block included shaded colonnades, fountains, and civic benches designed by philosophers instead of hostile anti-loitering committees. You might accidentally solve half of urban misery. Of course, Greek cities were not utopias. Sanitation varied, crowding happened, class disparities shaped access. But still, there's something deeply impressive about how often architecture supported bodily reality. Take theaters, for example. Greek theaters are famous for acoustics and drama, but they were also outdoor civic spaces requiring mass gathering under open skies. Performances, festivals, and ceremonies could last for hours. Audiences undoubtedly developed strategies for endurance. Cloaks, posture shifts, shade timing, perhaps the occasional discreet eye resting during particularly abstract choruses. No offense to Euripides, but everyone has limits. Gymnasiums, marketplaces, sanctuaries, assembly spaces all reveal overlapping civic architecture designed not solely for movement, but for presence. Presence includes pausing. This may be one of ancient Greece's quietest architectural lessons. Cities should not merely process bodies, they should host them. Not every moment demands output. Not every citizen must be in constant motion. Sometimes a city serves you best by giving you a place to sit when your sandals and soul are both overheating. Even street width could influence comfort. Narrower pathways in some residential zones created more shade. Materials mattered. Orientation mattered. Daily solar patterns mattered. And through it all, you see a society physically negotiating with environment through design. This doesn't mean Greeks consciously engineered nap culture in the modern sense, but they created civic ecologies where rest emerged naturally from built form. And perhaps that's even more elegant. No explicit command. No productivity rebellion. Just columns, breezes, and stones saying, "You look tired. Stay a while." As late afternoon light begins shifting from harsh white to warmer gold, shadows lengthen across marble. The square changes again. Areas once unbearable now invite return. Rested bodies rise. Commerce resumes. Debate sharpens. Architecture has done its quiet work. It protected. It moderated. It held space. And seated beneath one final colonnade, tracing cool fingertips over ancient stone worn smooth by generations of hands, backs, and perhaps very thoughtful naps, you realize Greek civilization was not built only by speeches or battles. It was also built by spaces that understood human frailty. A city of reason, yes, a city of beauty, certainly, but also, blessedly, a city where the walls themselves sometimes seemed to know you'd need a break. Section 11. And just as you begin to settle too comfortably into this Athenian fantasy, this lovely sunlit rhythm of shaded stoas, leisurely citizens, strategic naps, philosophical lounging, and architecture that practically whispers, "Rest here, weary mortal," history, wearing bronze armor and a deeply judgmental expression, abruptly drags you southward to Sparta. And Sparta, dear sleepy traveler, is not here for your soft little agora nap, at least not in the same way. Because if Athens often feels like a city that occasionally pauses to discuss ethics under an olive tree, Sparta feels more like a place where the olive tree itself might evaluate your discipline. Now, Sparta has been mythologized so aggressively over the centuries that separating reality from legend can feel like trying to untangle sandals in the dark. Popular culture loves to imagine Spartans as permanently shouting, shirtless demigods powered entirely by abs and patriotic rage. The truth, as usual, is more nuanced and much dustier. Sparta was a militarized society, yes, particularly for its male citizen class, the Spartiates. Discipline, endurance, austerity, and collective identity were deeply emphasized. From a young age, Spartan boys entered the agog, the state-sponsored educational and training system designed to produce obedient, resilient warriors. So right away, your chances of enjoying a spontaneous public nap in the middle of civic life are complicated. One of the best-known facts about Sparta is that it prioritized military readiness above many forms of luxury or intellectual experimentation celebrated elsewhere in Greece. Spartan culture famously valued toughness, brevity, and self-control. Decorative softness was not exactly a branding priority. And yet, even Sparta could not repeal human biology. This is where things get interesting, because while Spartan ideals emphasized endurance, training, and resilience, no society can function without sleep, pacing, or adaptation to climate. Historians are still debating how much later sources exaggerated Spartan severity for dramatic effect, but even highly disciplined systems require rhythms of exertion and recovery. So no, Spartans were not immortal sun-proof war machines. They sweated, they tired, they rested. The difference lies more in framing than function. In Athens, public rest could appear socially integrated into civic leisure. In Sparta, rest was more likely subordinated to discipline, communal order, or military necessity. Picture yourself now in a Spartan training ground rather than an Athenian stoa. Boys drill under supervision. Physical hardship is normalized. Meals are sparse. Comfort is intentionally limited. You are significantly less likely to see someone dramatically reclining in public while debating metaphysics, and significantly more likely to be told to stop whining. That said, strategic rest absolutely existed in military systems. Soldiers throughout history require sleep cycles, camp rhythms, and bodily maintenance. Spartan warriors trained for effectiveness, not spontaneous collapse. Exhaustion beyond function serves nobody in battle. So while cultural ideals discouraged softness, practical recovery remained unavoidable. A lesser-known fact is that Spartan communal life centered heavily around syssitia, shared messes where male citizens ate together. These common meals reinforced social cohesion and discipline. The infamous black broth, often described with more historical dread than culinary enthusiasm, probably did not encourage luxurious food comas, but shared rhythms still structured daily life. Honestly, if your lunch tastes like boiled austerity, you may nap less from satisfaction and more from emotional withdrawal. Spartan architecture and urban planning were also less monumental in the Athenian style. Sparta historically lacked the same concentration of grand civic structures and visual opulence. Ancient observers sometimes even commented on its relative simplicity. So, your public square nap beneath elegant painted colonnade aesthetic may need adjusting. Think fewer decorative stoas, more practical terrain, more communal barracks, more "this rock is fine." Still, the Peloponnesian climate remained hot. Shade remained useful. Trees remained trees. Even disciplined societies cannot train effectively while every citizen is one sunstroke away from seeing Ares personally. And then there are Spartan women, who, interestingly, compared to many Greek city-states, often had comparatively greater public visibility and physical training, though within highly specific social structures. Their lives were still shaped by Spartan priorities, but broader expectations around strength and contribution differed in notable ways from Athens. This reminds you once again that Greek culture was never singular. Athens naps one way, Sparta recovers another. Corinth does something else entirely, probably involving trade. Ancient Greek diversity matters. Sparta's famed brevity, laconic speech, named after Laconia, also adds a strangely humorous layer to this whole exploration. Imagine asking a Spartan whether midday rest is culturally appropriate, and receiving a one-word answer so efficient it somehow judges your entire lifestyle. Sit. Or perhaps, don't. And yet beneath all the cultural mythology, Spartan bodies remained bodies. Training grounds required pauses, campaigns required camp, children slept, adults recovered. Night still came. The distinction was often ideological. Rest should serve strength, not indulgence. Modern readers sometimes over-romanticize Spartan relentlessness, but real human systems are always more adaptive. Total denial of bodily need is fantasy, not civilization. So perhaps a Spartan nap, if it occurred publicly, would not carry Athenian leisure's relaxed social tone. It might instead feel tactical, sparse, almost utilitarian. Less I'm contemplating justice, and more, I need enough strength not to embarrass myself later. No embroidered pillow, no philosophical flourish, just survival with posture. As evening approaches over Laconian land, The image sharpens. Warriors resting in shade before drills resume, children recovering after exertion, citizens pacing themselves within rigid systems, bodies obeying sun, muscle, and fatigue despite ideology, and suddenly Sparta becomes more human. Not softer exactly, but realer. Because even in one of history's most disciplined societies, the body still whispers its ancient truths. Heat drains, muscles tire, eyes close. Perhaps not with Athenian elegance, perhaps not under painted stoas, but somewhere beneath Spartan severity, even the hardest warrior occasionally needed to sit down, becoming an inspirational cautionary tale. And honestly, that may be the most democratic thing about biology of all. Section 12. And after the stern bronze clang of Spartan discipline, after barracks and black broth and the unnerving suspicion that someone nearby is judging the way you blink, your journey softens again. Not into the wide public stoas of Athens exactly, but into quieter thresholds, inner courtyards, shaded domestic rooms, and the often overlooked spaces where half of Greek society lived. Rhythm's history too frequently narrates from the doorway. Because if you truly want to understand daily rest in ancient Greece, you cannot remain only in male civic spaces. You have to step inside. And here things become more private, more layered, and in many ways more constrained. Women's lives in ancient Greece varied significantly depending on city-state, status, wealth, and era. Sparta, as you've glimpsed, often differed from Athens. Elite Athenian women, particularly in classical periods, were frequently expected to spend much of their time within domestic spheres, especially compared to male citizens whose identities centered more visibly around public life. So while men may publicly doze beneath stoas and trees, women's midday fatigue often unfolded elsewhere: courtyards, loom rooms, kitchens, upper chambers, shaded interiors. This distinction matters. It would be misleading to imagine ancient Greek women simply resting privately, all day like serene vase paintings surrounded by folded linen and polite sunlight. Domestic labor could be intense: textile production, childcare, food preparation, household management, water coordination, supervising servants if wealthy enough to have them, or doing nearly everything yourself if not. The household, or oikos, was economically and socially foundational, and like all foundational systems, it often relied on enormous unseen labor. You step now through a modest doorway into an Athenian home centered around an internal courtyard. Sunlight spills into the open center, while surrounding rooms offer varying degrees of shade. This architectural arrangement was practical: light, airflow, privacy. One lesser-known fact is that Greek homes were often designed more inwardly than outwardly, especially in urban settings, which helped regulate both social boundaries and environmental comfort. Courtyards could become crucial climate moderators. You immediately feel the difference: less marketplace noise, more textile sounds, spinning, grinding, low voices, children, water. And here too, heat shapes rhythm. Afternoons may slow indoor labor where possible, or shift tasks according to temperature and light. Historians are still debating the exact daily scheduling patterns across households and classes, but domestic adaptation to climate was almost certainly constant. No one with functioning skin ignores Mediterranean summer. You may find women weaving in shaded areas, perhaps pausing during peak heat, perhaps not, depending on necessity. Textile work alone could consume vast amounts of time. Cloth production in antiquity was not a charming side hobby. It was essential labor. If modern laundry feels tedious, imagine literally producing fabric from raw fiber while also managing household logistics. Suddenly, quiet domestic life sounds significantly more cardio-intensive. Enslaved women and servants often bore especially heavy burdens here too. And once again, Greek domestic comfort was unevenly distributed. Wealth could create more shaded, spacious environments and delegated labor. Poverty narrowed options. Still, indoor architecture could provide opportunities for forms of rest less visible in public history. Women may not have publicly napped in the agora with philosophical swagger, but bodily rhythms did not vanish behind walls. Children slept, mothers rested when possible, older women paused, domestic workers stole moments. Shade, airflow, and enclosed space created different patterns of fatigue and restoration. This is where ancient history can feel frustratingly incomplete. Male authors dominate many surviving texts, meaning women's daily bodily experiences often appear filtered, fragmented, or implied, rather than richly detailed. Historians are still debating many specifics because evidence can be indirect, but absence of detailed writing does not mean absence of reality. Bodies still got tired, heat still existed, work still demanded pacing. And then there's religion. Women often played significant roles in household ritual, festivals, and certain religious practices. Sacred calendars structured domestic and public rhythms alike. Festivals could disrupt ordinary patterns, creating moments of altered routine, travel, gathering, or celebration. Imagine preparing ritual offerings in heavy heat and trying not to sweat directly onto sacred bread. History rarely highlights these glamorous details. A fascinating lesser-known point is that some women's festivals, such as the Thesmophoria, created female-centered ritual spaces distinct from everyday domestic restrictions. These events reveal that women's social rhythms were not wholly invisible or static. They had temporal and cultural variation. So while public squares may dominate historical imagery, women's rest often existed in architectures of enclosure rather than exposure. And perhaps this privacy changes the emotional texture of rest itself. A nap in the agora is social, visible, semi-civic. A pause in a shaded courtyard may feel stolen, intimate, domestic. Neither is simple. Both are shaped by structure. You begin to hear subtler sounds now. A loom's repetitive rhythm slowing, sandals removed indoors, a child's breathing, wind moving through an open center, the scrape of pottery. These spaces are not less historical because they are quieter. If anything, they may be more representative of ordinary continuity. Civilization is not only speeches and plazas, it is also thread, bread, water, shade. And perhaps this is one of the greatest distortions of historical memory. Monumental public life often overshadows domestic endurance. Yet the Greek world could not function without households, without women's labor, without private rhythms balancing public spectacle. So when afternoon deepens and the courtyard stones radiate warmth softened by shadow, you can imagine someone, mother, servant, daughter, grandmother, finally sitting, just briefly, a hand unclenched, a shoulder eased, eyes closed for one blessed moment before the next task arrives. Not dramatic, not commemorated in marble, but real. And somehow in this softer domestic half-light, ancient Greek rest becomes even more human. Because here there is no audience, no assembly, no philosophical performance, just heat, work, breath, and the quiet wisdom of pausing where the walls hold shade. Section 13. And as the sun slowly tilts westward over courtyards, rooftops, olive groves, gymnasiums, and stoas, your journey begins to stretch beyond Greece itself. Because cultures, like tired travelers, rarely stay put forever. Ideas move, architecture travels, meals migrate, and perhaps most inevitably of all, so do naps. The ancient Greek world, especially after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, did not simply remain a cluster of isolated city-states, preserving their own charmingly sweaty habits. Greek language, customs, urban design, philosophy, and daily rhythms spread widely across the Mediterranean and Near East through Hellenistic influence. And among these exports, alongside theater, mathematics, political ideas, and aggressively sculpted marble bodies, came broader cultural patterns shaped by climate and civic life. Now, to be fair, no empire ever officially issued a decree reading, "Be it known, shaded midday reclining shall henceforth be mandatory." But environmental adaptation, architectural forms, and social customs travel remarkably well when they make practical sense. Greek-founded or Greek-influenced cities from Egypt to Asia Minor often incorporated colonnades, plazas, gymnasiums, and civic planning principles. These structures did more than symbolize power, they shaped bodily experience. Public life in warm climates continued to require shade, pacing, and timing. You can almost feel it in Alexandria now, where Hellenistic urban sophistication mingles with Egyptian sun. The exact customs differ, populations diversify, and local traditions persist, but one thing remains hilariously constant: no one enjoys overheating unnecessarily. Historians are still debating the degree specific Greek social practices around public leisure directly shaped later regional customs. But Greek architectural and civic frameworks undeniably influenced Mediterranean urbanism. And then, of course, come the Romans. Ah, yes, Rome, the civilization that looked at Greek culture and essentially said, "Excellent, we'll take this, enlarge it, add roads, bureaucracy, bathhouses, and significantly more confidence." Roman elites famously absorbed enormous amounts of Greek art, philosophy, religion, and education. Greek tutors educated Roman aristocrats. Greek architecture inspired Roman building. Greek thought permeated Roman intellectual life. And daily rhythms? Those too evolved through shared Mediterranean realities. The Roman meridiaio, or midday rest, offers a fascinating example. While Roman life differed greatly from Greek civic structures, midday pauses remained practical in many contexts, especially under southern climates. The later concept of the siesta, more famously associated with other Mediterranean cultures, reflects broader environmental adaptation patterns rather than one single Greek invention, but the continuity is hard to ignore. Heat remains undefeated. One lesser-known detail is that Roman houses, especially wealthier domus, also centered around courtyards and airflow-conscious design, much like Greek domestic principles adapted and transformed. Public baths, shaded porticos, and forum spaces likewise created bodily rhythms around climate and social life. In short, the Greeks did not single-handedly invent daytime rest, but they were deeply embedded in an ancient Mediterranean pattern that later civilizations refined, expanded, and inherited. And this matters because it reframes public napping not as some quirky Greek oddity, but as part of a larger human strategy. Civilizations in hot climates repeatedly discover the same thing. If you ignore the sun wins. Even military campaigns adapted. Alexander's armies, marching across diverse climates, had to negotiate exhaustion, heat, and timing constantly. Massive historical conquests may sound glamorous until you remember they also involve thousands of sweaty men desperately hoping someone planned water stops. As Hellenistic cities spread eastward, Greek gymnasiums, theaters, and civic institutions often followed. Public social rhythms blended with local cultures, producing hybrids rather than copies. This blending is important. Greek customs did not simply clone themselves. They interacted, adapted, merged, and somewhere in that exchange, the logic of shade, pacing, and bodily realism persisted. You begin to realize that ancient public rest is less a niche cultural curiosity and more a recurring civilizational intelligence. Take Spain centuries later. Take Italy. Take parts of North Africa. Take the Ottoman world. Take modern Mediterranean villages where shutters close against afternoon blaze. Different histories, different politics, same sun. A fascinating irony emerges here. Many modern industrialized cultures now treat midday rest as laziness, despite thousands of years of environmental logic supporting it. Artificial lighting, factory schedules, office norms, and global capitalism often bulldoze natural climate rhythms in favor of uniform productivity. Ancient Greeks, Romans, and many later societies might find this deeply confusing. You mean you can avoid peak heat and choose not to? Remarkable. Of course, not all continuity is direct lineage. Historians rightly caution against simplistic, Greeks invented everything narratives, because human adaptation often emerges independently under similar conditions. But the Greek case offers one of history's richest documented examples of how civic life, architecture, social status, philosophy, and environment converged around daily rhythms, including rest. And that convergence echoes. As twilight begins to soften your imagined Mediterranean world, you can almost trace an invisible line, from Athenian stoa to Hellenistic boulevard to Roman courtyard to shaded Spanish plaza to modern cafe shutters closing in afternoon heat. Not identical, but related in spirit. A body under sun learns, a city under heat adapts, a culture under climate negotiates. And perhaps this is the real legacy, not merely empire or philosophy, but practical wisdom quietly repeated across generations. Sit when needed, pause when wise, build shade. Respect noon. So as evening breeze finally arrives, cooling stone that has held sunlight all day, you lean back and smile at the absurd continuity of human history. Across languages, empires, religions, and centuries, people keep discovering the same humble truth. Sometimes civilization advances one brilliant idea at a time, and sometimes it advances because someone had the sense to rest before passing out in public. Section 14. And now, as your long day wandering through marble glare, olive shade, gymnasium dust, domestic courtyards, Spartan austerity, and Mediterranean inheritance begins to glow with evening softness, you arrive at a curious crossroads, the place where ancient wisdom collides headfirst with modern self-importance. Because somewhere along the way, many contemporary societies, particularly those obsessed with hustle, optimization, and suspiciously aggressive morning routines, developed a strange habit of treating rest as moral weakness. In ancient Greece, lounging gracefully beneath a stoa with one sandal half off would probably find this absolutely ridiculous. You know the modern script: wake before dawn, maximize output, schedule every minute, drink something expensive with caffeine, pretend exhaustion is ambition, collapse later while calling it success. Now, to be fair, discipline has its place. Ancient Greeks were hardly strangers to labor, endurance, or civic responsibility. But what their world repeatedly demonstrates is something many modern frameworks forget. Human productivity does not always increase by denying human biology. In fact, often the opposite. The Greeks, especially in climates that demanded adaptation, frequently organized life around rhythms rather than relentless continuity. Morning action, midday moderation, evening return. This wasn't laziness. It was timing. And timing, as every olive tree, philosopher, and overheated merchant has quietly been trying to tell you, matters. Historians are still debating how universal or socially distributed public rest truly was across all Greek populations, but the broader pattern is unmistakable. Environment shaped behavior. You did not earn moral superiority by pretending the sun wasn't real. Imagine introducing a classical Athenian to a windowless office where someone proudly eats lunch at their desk under fluorescent lighting while answering messages during a wellness break. He might assume this is punishment. One lesser-known irony is that many ancient philosophical traditions, Greek among them, were deeply concerned with eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or well-being. Though complex and not reducible to take naps, these traditions often explored balance, virtue, bodily life, moderation, and sustainable living more holistically than some modern grind cultures. Even Aristotle, who certainly valued purposeful action, did not exactly propose burn yourself out answering meaningless correspondence. And yet modernity, especially after industrialization, increasingly standardized time in ways ancient societies often did not. Factory schedules, clocks, wage systems, electric light all transformed relationships with natural cycles. Work became less solar and more mechanical. The sun no longer decided. The shift did. This shift brought many advancements, of course, but also distortions. Rest became compartmentalized, often privatized, and occasionally stigmatized. Public napping, unless culturally normalized in specific places, can now look suspicious, as though your body's needs are somehow an HR violation. Ancient Greeks might gently suggest you calm down, not because they rejected work, but because they often recognized pacing. And here's the truly funny part. Modern science increasingly supports strategic rest, sleep hygiene, circadian rhythms, and even short naps for cognitive performance. So after centuries of pretending bodily needs were inconvenient, many people are now enthusiastically discovering what hot climate societies understood while wearing linen. Brains work better when not profoundly exhausted. Revolutionary. You picture Socrates hearing about productivity podcasts and quietly asking whether your optimized suffering has actually made you wiser. There's also the social dimension. Ancient public spaces often allowed rest to remain visible, communal, normalized. Today, rest is often hidden, individualized, or commercialized. Instead of a shaded stoa, perhaps you purchase a subscription, a meditation app, or an overpriced ergonomic chair marketed like sacred revelation. Meanwhile, Diogenes is somewhere laughing from his barrel. Of course, modern life is not ancient Greece, and romanticizing antiquity too much would be foolish. Ancient systems contained inequality, hardship, disease, and exclusions many modern people would absolutely reject. But that does not mean every old rhythm was primitive. Sometimes progress means technology. Sometimes progress means remembering what bodies have always known. Climate, too, remains relevant. In many hot regions today, midday pauses still make practical sense. Yet globalization often imposes standardized expectations disconnected from local environmental realities. The result can feel absurd: glass towers and punishing heat, endless commutes, burnout framed as virtue. The Greeks, Romans, and many later Mediterranean cultures instead often structured around practical coexistence with place. This may be one of history's gentlest lessons. Efficiency without wisdom can become self-defeating. You are not a machine. You are a sun-sensitive mammal with ambitions. And perhaps that's okay. As evening settles across your imagined agora, You watch workers return, conversations rise again, commerce reawaken, and public life resume after pause. Rest did not destroy the day, it sustained it. That distinction feels important. The pause was not surrender, it was calibration. So maybe ancient Greek public napping was never really about sleeping in squares, at least not fundamentally. Maybe it was about acknowledging limits without shame. Maybe it was about designing life around reality. Maybe it was about understanding that flourishing includes recovery. And perhaps, just perhaps, your worth need not be measured solely by how efficiently you ignore exhaustion. You smile now, watching golden light warm the columns one last time, and imagine all those ancient citizens who sat, reclined, closed their eyes, and returned later to politics, philosophy, trade, and ordinary life. Not defeated, not lazy, just human. And in a world increasingly determined to convince you otherwise, that may be one of the most radical lessons history can offer. Sometimes the wisest civilization in the room is the one sensible enough to sit in the shade. Section 15. And now as the sun finally loosens its bright grip on stone and sea, as long shadows pour like cool ink across marble steps, market stalls, temple columns, and dusty roads, you arrive at the gentle closing of this ancient day, where everything that once shimmered with heat begins to soften. Athens exhales. The agora that baked beneath noon now glows amber. The white blaze of midday has mellowed into honeyed gold, and suddenly the same stones that threatened to roast your sandals now hold warmth like memory rather than punishment. Olive leaves flicker silver green in the lowering light. Doves settle. Merchants gather the last of their wares. Philosophers, who earlier may or may not have been meditating horizontally, resume their debates with evening dignity restored. And you, after wandering through public squares, shaded stoas, Spartan severity, gymnasium dust, domestic courtyards, temple dreams, and all the beautifully ordinary mechanics of surviving a Greek afternoon, finally understand something simple enough to feel profound. Public napping was never really the whole story. It was merely one visible thread in a much larger tapestry, an expression of how ancient Greeks negotiated life itself. Because beneath all the statues, myths, politics, and geometry, they were still bodies in climate, bodies in cities, bodies in systems, bodies under one enormous Mediterranean sun. And rather than constantly battling that reality, they often adapted to it. That may be the true elegance. You think back now, back to the stoa's cool columns, to workers crouched beneath carts, to women pausing in courtyard shade, to athletes catching breath, to old men on benches, to sacred dreams in healing temples, to Spartan recovery without fanfare. Different lives, different freedoms, different burdens, but one recurring pattern. Pause, recover, resume. A rhythm older than productivity charts, older than empires, older perhaps than history itself. One of the lesser-known beauties of studying daily life rather than only wars and kings is that it reveals civilizations not merely in triumph, but in texture. The Greeks did not only build Parthenons or stage tragedies or invent philosophical schools. They also adjusted cloaks for shade. They sat near fountains. They timed errands around heat. They understood, consciously or not, that flourishing sometimes depends less on heroic endurance than on sustainable rhythm. Historians are still debating countless details about ordinary Greek life, how much varied by class, region, or era, how idealized literary portrayals may be, how public and private customs shifted over centuries. And that uncertainty is part of the beauty too. History is rarely one fixed image. It shimmers, like heat over stone. But even through debate, fragments align. Climate mattered, bodies mattered, rest mattered, and perhaps this is why the story lingers. Because in your own world, bright screens, constant notifications, endless schedules, you may feel farther from ancient Greece than from the moon. Yet beneath modern chaos, your body remains astonishingly old-fashioned. It still tires, it still seeks shade, it still slows after food, it still dreams. Your ancestors may have traded in agoras instead of answering emails, but somewhere deep beneath technology, your nervous system probably understands a shaded olive grove better than your calendar does. The city around you now dims further. Torches flicker, evening meals begin, symposia gather, sandals scrape more softly. The heat finally releases the earth, and cool air brushes your skin with the quiet mercy of survival. And now, public squares no longer belong to naps, but belong to return. Voices rise again, but gentler. Laughter replaces strain. A musician tunes strings somewhere nearby. Children drift homeward. A dog stretches with the solemn dignity of a philosopher who has mastered stillness. You sit one final time beneath a familiar column, no longer merely escaping the sun, but honoring the day's long lesson. Ancient Greece was not boring at all, of course. Not really. It was simply human at close range. And sometimes, the most human truths appear in the least dramatic places. A bench, a breeze, a shaded wall, a brief closing of the eyes before continuing. So tonight, as darkness settles over marble and memory alike, perhaps you carry forward not only images of temples and thinkers, but something softer, a permission to move with your world, not always against it, to respect your limits, to pause without shame, to remember that even civilizations famed for brilliance were built not by endless motion alone, but by people wise enough to rest when the sun grew too fierce. The cicadas quiet now, the stones cool, the city so alive all day begins to murmur itself toward sleep, and you drift with it, past olive groves, through painted stoas, beyond fountains and courtyards, carried gently into that ancient universal rhythm. Breathe in, breathe out, pause, return. So as your thoughts grow slower and the bright outlines of history blur into softer shapes, let your mind rest there, in the golden dust of evening Greece, where tired feet finally stop wandering, where even philosophers close their eyes, where the old stones keep their warmth just a little longer, and where, beneath fading stars, the ancient world reminds you in its quietest voice that rest was never weakness, only wisdom, practiced slowly. Open quote, open quote, open quote, end of script. Sweet dreams, close quote, close quote, close quote.